Touching back down on the planet, they had landed the ship nearby their lair in a neighbouring forest to conceal the ship's whereabouts, as well as the location of their nearby hideout. As they found the cavern's entrance, they proceeded to descend into the bowels of darkness. Each step saw the light from the sun fade further and further away, as they descend and greeted by the torches' cackle and whisper of their flames throughout the cavern. Nearing the central space in the cavern, the cultists walked in formation, with the acolyte holding the child wrapped in cloth and walking in the foremost position, their steps all matching each other's. Walking through the open space, they make their way to a hidden room found deeper in the caverns. This room was dedicated for the followers of Havoc only. No one else was allowed to step inside unless granted permission by the followers themselves. The entrance itself was guarded by 2 heavy guardsmen. The guardsmen crossed their weapons in an X shape, as one of them commands with a booming voice that reverberated throughout their armour that no one was allowed inside. The acolyte then claims that they have been requested by the followers and must be allowed inside. The guardsmen turned to each other before looking back again as one of the guards entered the room to see if what the acolyte said was true. After a few seconds, the guard returned. The guard told them that only the acolyte may enter and that everyone else was to leave. Whilst the other cultists were disappointed in this decision, seeing as they also helped in finding the child, they turned back with disgruntled faces as the acolyte prepared themselves before they entered. The door opened eerily as its squeaking hinges echoed throughout the room, bouncing off of the cavern's cold walls before it slammed behind them, the bang creating a bigger echo than the squeaking, as silence is returned once more. A thick fog crawled along the floor of the room as it whirled and formed around the acolyte's feet and ankles. Walking forward, their footsteps bounced from wall to wall as the acolyte inspected every detail of the room, seeing as this was only their second time entering. The first was when they were appointed the role of acolyte. More of the same words that were carved throughout the cavern could be seen. The same poems and prophecies etched into the very rock of the room. Stone pillars with strange images and patterns were also etched into them, telling the same story of the prophecy. The room itself was lit by more torches and more of the candlelit chandeliers, alongside a few tiki torches stuck into the ground. As the acolyte slowly approached the ramp leading up to the central platform, it is here where the followers of Havoc resided day after day in a ring formation, with one stood at its centre. A low droning hum reverberated around the room, sending shivers down the acolyte's spine. It was then that they came to a complete stop. One of the followers spoke out loud, though loud would be the opposite word for the tone of his voice. The follower spoke in a very eerie and raspy whisper towards the acolyte. The acolyte tells them that they have the saviour with them, as at that moment, the cultists all lifted their heads up toward the acolyte, their faces blackened by the heavy shadow caused by their hoods, making any facial features impossible to identify. The central follower requested that the child be brought to them, as the acolyte handed the child to the follower. They began unravelling the child from the cloth they were tucked inside, and revealing the small, monochrome child. A follower then requested information on what happened to the pendant, to which they responded that it was a necessary sacrifice to ensure the child's survival. The follower looked back down at the child, who was fast asleep, and then looked back as they commended the efforts of the acolyte, and with that, The acolyte then turned back around and descended the ramp to leave the room, as silence fell once more. The follower, holding the child, proceeded to lift them high into the air, as they all began to speak a harrowing chant. Praise be to Helmfire. Praise be to Helmfire. Praise be to Helmfire. Since that day, several years had passed, and in all that time the followers of Havoc had been perfecting the child day by day to bring him to a point where he could fulfill the prophecy. But they still had a long way to go, and this was merely the beginning. And while to the cult that did not faze them, this was very different for the child, who was to bear anything and everything they threw at him. Sleepless nights, days without sustenance, endless hours of extreme training, verbal abuse for the slightest mishap, and physical torture for the bigger failures. The fact he was blind had also irritated the followers, and, on many occasions, blamed the child for this fact. Life was a living hell for the child, and there was no end in sight, no sign of help. They were completely alone, and resistance was useless. This was how the followers sought to bring about the prophecy, to fuel someone with so much hatred and trauma that when the time came, they would not hesitate nor show mercy in unleashing his rage. All of this continued for several months, as months became years, and years became decades. There was one day that would both physically and mentally scar the child for the rest of their life. As the child grew older, their body began to change in ways that the cult did not like, more so with 2 points that caught their attention. The first was when they noticed 2 appendages growing from the top of the child's head. The appendages resembled ears akin to those of a fox or other canine. The second point of interest was when the child started growing multiple tails on their lower back, again akin to what would be seen on a fox. This infuriated the followers of Havoc, as when they looked upon them, it reminded them of who brought them to the shackles of defeat and forced them to live a life of ruin. Something needed to be done. The Saviour could not be tainted with such cursed imagery. One night, whilst the child was sleeping, the 2 heavy guardsmen woke him and dragged him from his room, holding him by the arms as his feet dragged along the floor. Any resistance was useless as the guards had a tight hold over him. As the guards approached their destination, they ignored the child's cries and question of where they were taking him as they got closer and closer. It was then that the guards stopped. The child, of course blind to anything and everything, could only hear as 3 loud bangs reverberated around him. A few seconds of silence followed, when an eerie creak filled the silent space as the guards marched in again. The guards brought him to the followers, as they then threw him onto an altar and began strapping him down as tight as they could. The followers thanked them, as the guards turned around and slammed the door behind them, the sound again echoing as silence quickly followed. The silence felt eternal, the child wanting to ask where he was and what was happening. But fear kept his words at bay, and all that could be heard instead was his frightened and unsteady breathing. "You are tainted." The followers all spoke in unison, their voices resonating like a choir. "You must be purged." The child's heart rate increased rapidly as their breathing became shorter and faster. One follower began walking to the altar, as another follower stepped forward holding a locked box and presented it to the follower standing over the child. Unlocking the box revealed a pristine crescent-shaped blade, with symbols and words carved into the blade and its handle. Raising the blade in the air, Time stopped for what felt like an eternity, as silence hung like a great fog, making it seem as if the air became thicker and harder to breathe. Then, with a resounding thud, the blade was brought down and cut right through the first ear, blood spurting from the wound as the child let out a blood-curdling scream that filled the entire room, their tears seeping and soaking into the blindfold that covered over his eyes as they wriggled and squirmed to free themselves, but the binds kept him strapped down. Lifting the blade again, they made a second swing for the other ear. This time, however, the blade got caught mid-slice and wouldn't budge so easily. This sent waves of white-hot, searing pain throughout the child's head as they continued to scream, their throat becoming irritated with how much they were, as the cult started wriggling the knife to remove it from its lodged position, amplifying the pain. When the follower finally managed to remove the blade, 2 other followers held the child's head in place, as the followers with the blade made ready for another swing. This time, the cut was successful, removing his final ear for good. Blood continued to pour from the wounds as the followers made attempts to clean them and tried to stem the bleeding. But even after all this, the nightmare was still not over, as there was the matter of the tails to be dealt with. So, as they finally patched up the wounds on the top of his head, the followers started releasing the straps on the upper part of the altar, as the child then leapt up and tried to escape, but because he was still bound by the lower half, and with the followers holding him in place, the attempt to escape was futile. When they got the child under control, they then held the tail still to make the cut easier. One by one, they furiously slammed the blade down onto the tails, as some came off with one swing, while others required multiple. Once more the pain climbing higher and higher as they showed no mercy to the child's cries. As the followers finished patching up the wounds, another follower brought out a syringe with a strange liquid inside. The follower placed the syringe into the child and pressed downward, forcing the liquid inside them. This strange concoction was to prevent any regenerative cells in growing back the child's ears and tails. And with this, they called the guards inside and instructed them to take the child back to their room. Waking up several hours later, the child sat up from their bed as the pain from their injuries returned with even the slightest movement. Feeling the top of his head, he could feel it was wrapped tightly in bandages, as was the same on his lower back. In that moment, the child had several thoughts racing through his mind, but had answers to none as he lay back down on the bed, silence filling the space around him. He didn't know what to feel. Rage, sadness, emptiness, all of them, or none at all. An empty shell whose life amalgamated to nothing but burning pain and endless suffering, all for a prophecy that he had no choice in the matter of whether he wanted this life or not.